Random House Audio presents The Democracy Project, A History, a Crisis, a Movement, by David Graeber, read for you by Gardner. Dedication to my father. Introduction. On April 26, 2012, about 30 activists from Occupy Wall Street gathered on the steps of New York's Federal Hall, across the street from the stock exchange. For more than a month, we had been trying to reestablish a foothold in Lower Manhattan to replace the camp we'd been evicted from 6 months earlier at Zuccotti Park. Even if we weren't able to establish a new camp, we were hoping to at least find some place we could hold regular assemblies and set up our library and kitchens. The great advantage of Zuccotti Park was that it was a place where anyone interested in what we were doing knew they could always come to find us, to learn about upcoming actions or just talk politics. Now, the lack of such a place was causing endless problems. The city authorities, however, had decided that we would never have another Zuccotti. Wherever we found a spot we could legally set up shop, they simply changed the laws and drove us off. When we tried to establish ourselves in Union Square, city authorities changed park regulations. When a band of occupiers started sleeping on the sidewalk on Wall Street itself, relying on a judicial decision that explicitly said citizens had a right to sleep on the street in New York as a form of political protest, the city deemed that part of Lower Manhattan a special security zone in which the law did not apply. Finally, we settled on the Federal Hall steps, a broad marble staircase leading up to a statue of George Washington, guarding the door to the building in which the Bill of Rights had been signed 223 years before. The steps were not under city jurisdiction. They were federal land, under the administration of the National Park Service, and representatives of the U.S. Park Police, cognizant perhaps that the entire space was considered a monument to civil liberties, had told us they had no objections to our occupying the steps, as long as no one actually slept there. The steps were wide enough that they could easily accommodate a couple of hundred people, and at first about that many occupiers showed up. But before long the city had moved in and convinced the park's people to let them effectively take over. They'd erected steel barriers around the perimeter, and others that divided the steps themselves into 2 compartments. We quickly came to refer to them as the freedom cages. A SWAT team was positioned by the entrance, and a white-shirted police commander carefully monitored everyone who tried to enter, informing them that for safety reasons no more than 20 people were allowed in either cage at any time. Nonetheless, a determined handful persevered. They kept up a 24-hour presence, taking shifts, organizing teach-ins during the day, engaging in impromptu debates with bored Wall Street traders who wandered over during breaks, and keeping vigil on the marble stairs at night. Soon large signs were banned, then anything made of cardboard. Then came the random arrests. The police commander wanted to make clear to us that even if he couldn't arrest all of us, he could certainly arrest any one of us for pretty much any reason at any time. That day alone I had seen one activist shackled and led off for a noise violation while chanting slogans, and another, an Iraq War veteran, booked on public obscenity charges for using 4-letter words while making a speech. Perhaps it was because we'd advertised the event as a speak-out. The officer in charge seemed to be making a point. Even at the very birthplace of the First Amendment, he still had the power to arrest us just for engaging in political speech. A friend of mine named Lopi, famous for attending marches on a giant tricycle emblazoned with a colorful placard that read Jubilee, had organized the event, billing it as Speak Out of Grievances Against Wall Street, a peaceable assembly on the steps of the Federal Hall Memorial Building, the birthplace of the Bill of Rights, which is currently under lockdown from the Army of the 1%. Myself, I'd never been much of a rabble-rouser. During the entire time I'd been involved in Occupy, I'd never once made a speech. So I was hoping to be there mainly as a witness, to provide moral and organizational support. For much of the first half hour of the event, as one occupier after another moved to the front of the cage, before an impromptu collection of video cameras on the sidewalk, to talk about war, ecological devastation, the corruption of government, I lingered on the margins, trying to chat up the police. "So you're part of a SWAT team," I said to one grim-faced young man guarding the entrance to the cages, a large assault rifle at his side. "Now, what does that stand for, SWAT?" "Special Weapons and Tactics," he said, quickly, before I would have any chance to get out the original name for the unit, which was Special Weapons Assault Team. "I see. So I'm curious, what sort of special weapons do your commanders think might be required to deal with 30 unarmed citizens engaging in peaceable assembly on the federal steps?" "It's just a precaution," he replied uncomfortably. I'd already passed up 2 invitations to speak, but Lopi was persistent, so eventually I figured I'd better say something, however brief. So I took my place in front of the cameras, glanced up at George Washington gazing at the sky over the New York Stock Exchange, and started improvising. "It strikes me that it's very appropriate that we are meeting here today on the steps of the very building where the Bill of Rights was signed. It's funny. Most Americans think of themselves as living in a free country, the world's greatest democracy. They feel it's our constitutional rights and freedoms, placed there by our founding fathers, that define us as a nation, that make us who we really are. Even if you listen to politicians, that give us the right to invade other countries more or less at will. But actually, you know, the men who wrote the Constitution didn't want it to include a Bill of Rights. That's why they're amendments. They weren't in the original document. The only reason that all those ringing phrases about freedom of speech and freedom of assembly ended up in the Constitution is because anti-federalists like George Mason and Patrick Henry were so outraged when they saw the final draft that they began to mobilize against ratification unless the text was changed. Changed to include, among other things, the right to engage in that very kind of popular mobilization. That terrified the Federalists, since one of the reasons they convened the Constitutional Convention to begin with was to head off the danger they saw of even more radical popular movements that had been calling for a democratization of finance, even debt cancellation. Mass public assemblies and an outbreak of popular debate like they'd seen during the Revolution was the very last thing they wanted. So, eventually, James Madison gathered up a list of more than 200 proposals and used them to write the actual text of what we now call the Bill of Rights. Power never gives up anything voluntarily. Insofar as we have freedoms, it's not because some great wise founding fathers granted them to us. It's because people like us insisted on exercising those freedoms by doing exactly what we're doing here, before anyone was willing to acknowledge that they had them. Nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution does it say anything about America being a democracy. There's a reason for that. Men like George Washington were openly opposed to democracy, which makes it a bit odd we're standing here under his statue today. But the same was true of all of them. Madison, Hamilton, Adams. They wrote explicitly that they were trying to set up a system that could head off and control the dangers of democracy, even though it was people who did want democracy that had made the revolution that put them in power to begin with. And of course most of us are here because we still don't think we're living under a democratic system in any meaningful sense of the term. I mean, look around you. That SWAT team over there tells you everything you really need to know. Our government has become little more than a system of institutionalized bribery where you can get hauled off to jail just for saying so. Maybe at this point they can still only keep us in jail for a day or two at a time, for the most part, but surely they're doing their best to change that. But they wouldn't be locking us up at all if they didn't know it's true. There's nothing that scares the rulers of America more than the prospect of democracy breaking out. And if there is a prospect of that, if anyone are heirs to those who are willing to take to the streets to demand a Bill of Rights, it's pretty much come down to us. Before that moment when Lopi pushed me on the stage, I hadn't really been thinking of Occupy Wall Street as rooted in any grand tradition in U.S. history. I'd been more interested in talking about its roots in anarchism, feminism, or even the global justice movement. But I think in retrospect what I said was true. After all, there's something strangely incoherent about the way we're taught to think about democracy in America. On the one hand, we're constantly told that democracy is just a matter of electing politicians to run the government. On the other, we're aware that most Americans love democracy, hate politicians, and are skeptical about the very idea of government. How can all these things be true? Clearly, when Americans embrace democracy, they can only be thinking of something
Sample complete. Ready to continue?